Well, let's talk a little bit about your training. You mentioned the fact that you've trained in internal medicine, you trained in anesthesia, you did fellowships. What was life like during your residencies and also during your medical school?
Well, so I was at Mass General back in the early 80s, as I mentioned, and I actually loved residency. I loved everything about it. I loved the fact that we had uniforms. We had the white pants and the white shirts, and the hospitals were just your all-around function was to be at the hospital, and you would go home to sleep, but they would see to it that you were fed and you were clothed, which is a little different than now. And if you needed to stay at the hospital on a night you weren't on call, they had a bunker for you. So that you could get away with probably staying at the hospital for weeks if you needed to. And I like the fact that the place where I trained, Mass General, had so many interesting patients, and the patients were, when they walked in the door, they had so much faith in MGH. And sometimes I was always amazed that, you know, here I am, 1 or 2 years out of medical school, and they would have that much faith in me as a resident. The attendings were phenomenal. The Stephen B. Calderwoods. I mean, there are some of my attendings, Lloyd Axelrod, who were just amazing. And I look back on it now, and they shaped me.
Right.
There are a couple of attendings that I remember distinctly. They were such sticklers to doing things in a methodical way.
Sure.
And they did it over and over again. It was a part of their DNA. And as you saw that and you learned that in that environment, it became such a part of you. And infectious disease at Mass General was absolutely, it was just a wonderful place to be, because people were transferred there to be treated.
Yeah.
I mean, you would see everything, leishmania, you would see lower diseases that you read about in medical school. I really loved the training there. It was very hard. On call every other day for the emergency room. We would go in at 12, you get off the next morning, you come back the next day, 12, you get off that whole day for 24 hours, come back the next day, and it was expected. I don't know about the controversy about the hours and your performance, but I'll tell you one thing, the volume of patients that you saw and the things that you did in my internal medicine residency made you very comfortable going forward. You know, you got to the point where you could do, and the same thing is true, as I mentioned, with my anesthesia residency. My anesthesia residency, you saw a lot, you did a lot, you know, and I love being at Mass General for anesthesia. I learned a lot, I did a lot. And, you know, transitioning for me was not a smooth transition, because I'm going from a not so acute science, clinical science and practice, to a more acute setting. So that was a transition, but I love the fact that it was pharmacology in action. So I enjoyed that. And then I've always wanted to go into anesthesia, even from medical school. But at the time that I was in medical school, this is what I was told. That anesthesia was a low esteemed profession, and that only foreigners went into anesthesia back then, and that I needed to go into internal medicine because that was a profession that, you know, was well respected. And at the time, anesthesia was under the Department of Surgery. So the anesthesiologists in many situations, even in community hospitals, they functioned under the Department of Surgery. The Department of Surgery oversaw the departments of anesthesia. It's very different today. When I practiced anesthesia, there were no pulse oximeter, there was no capnograph, there was no end-tidal CO2. There was a blood pressure cuff, and there was a precordial, a stethoscope, or an esophageal stethoscope. There was a little small EKG monitor about this big. And there was your ability to examine the patient. That was it.
It was a seat of the pants in the early 80s operation in which you were running by physical examination and basic vital signs. The introduction of the pulse oximeter was a enormous innovation that had very measurable effects on outcomes.
And part of my first month there, I learned one basic concept. Trust no one in anesthesia, not even your mother. I mean, you could have someone who give you a break and that didn't practice the same kind of monitoring you did. And if you came back and you found out that something went awry, you'd have to find out pretty quickly, or you'd be in trouble.
Yep.
And the problem is that me as a resident could emulate the attendings that I saw, but there were some attendings that didn't practice the way other attendings
Sure.
practiced, and they did things very differently. Even when it came down to monitoring, you know, I had two fantastic attendings, Marlene Myers and John Ryan, and they were excellent. But when I left that tutorialship, which is what they give you, and I started my anesthesia residency, I was like amazed that there were attendings that did not have the same kind of rules,
Yeah.
and the same kind of
standards.
habits and standards, and all under one hospital. And so I learned, I would say I learned the hard way that when you're changing from breaking to non-breaking, that was an issue of whether or not you leave the room and someone gives you a break and you come back and things are different. And for me, that was a harsh reality, is that people don't practice the same and they don't have the
Right.
same standards.
Right.
And that's where, you know, you have a lot of events.
Yep. So we've learned a lot about your practice and about your training. Talk to me a little bit about what drew you into medicine to begin with.
So I was a high school senior, and I graduated from Compton Senior High School.
California.
Yes. Not a lot of people know about Compton. And I went to a pre-med conference, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Leland Cox. And he was volunteering time, mentoring students, and he took us to the cadaver lab. And I saw this cadaver in a cadaver bin. And I was amazed. That I was just totally amazed by the fact that, oh my goodness, I wonder what my liver looks like. I wonder what the inside of my eye looks like. And I was just so curious about my own anatomy and my own function, that it drove me to pursue, you know, more things and, you know, reading. I went to the library and read up on different health, you know, organ systems, and I read a little bit about healthcare, but more about organ systems. And I went back and took a bunch of sciences the following. I had taken some sciences already. I took physiology. I think in that year I took physics, and I took chemistry, and then I enrolled in a junior college. And so my school was okay, but it wasn't really strong in chemistry, and I wanted to really fortify my background before I went to college. So I started taking junior college classes. I took junior college classes in the between my junior year and my senior year, after my senior year, before going into college. So when I got to college, I was accepted as a sophomore. So I finished college in 3 years. And every summer, my mother always thought it was important for us to go to school. She says, the school is free. It's free. You can get a good education. And that was her mantra. She said, stay in school and go to church. Those were the most important things. And you know, we're a large family. Every last one of us are college graduates. And I decided to go to USC. And there I became pre-med. I joined a couple of clubs. One was a pre-med club. And I love the idea of making a difference in someone's life through healthcare. And I applied to medical school. I went to medical school. Initially, I was going to Case Western Reserve, and I actually went there, and then I got so homesick, I called UCLA and asked them if they would take me back before medical school started, and they did. And so I wind up at UCLA Medical School, had an incredible time there. I had an anatomy professor. His name was R.J. Lass. And he was all-knowing. I mean, really. He would make stories up about different nerves, and he would make stories up about different vessels. He goes, oh, I see that's the thyroid artery. There's old George down there. I mean, he was just, it was a life for him, and there was a story to every cavity in the body, you know, and so I love that. And I will say that I like the fact that he reminded me of my geometry teacher in the 9th grade, who had endless energy, endless energy, and I had the same kind of feeling that I had in geometry, which really spurred me. It just spurred me on to just think that I could actually do something in life that would make a difference. And my geometry teacher is Mr. Ullum, who I will never forget. He had a GeoStar list, and the list was 13. And I was number 13 on the first GeoStar list. And I said, I'm going to make it my business. I want to go up that list. And I worked hard. And by the end of the year, I was number 1 GeoStar. So I tell people that, and they look at me like, what's that about? I said, I was the number 1 GeoStar. But I gained confidence from that 9th grade experience. And that confidence permeated the rest of my life. And so I always go back and I thank him. And then when I was at UCLA, I did very well. You know, I did extraordinarily well in my basic science, and I did well in my clinical. And I saw my advisor, and he was the one who told me that you need to do internal medicine. Don't go into anesthesia. But there was another guy by the name of Wilbur Jordan who was doing a fellowship, and he was a community medicine specialist. And he was talking to me one day. He says, well, let me see what your transcripts look like. So I showed him my transcripts. And he said, what programs are you applying to? I said, well, you know, my advisor told me that I should apply to Los Angeles County Hospital, Charity Memorial. He says, because I'm interested in helping poor people. He says, these are good places for you. And so he saw my match list. And he took it and he tore it up. He says, you know what, your grades and your board scores, you belong at Mass General. And I thought, oh. And I said, you the CPC in the New England Journal of Medicine? Because I'd always loved the CPCs. I would sleep with those things under my bed. And I just never dreamed that I would actually go there. And because I was in the interview slots, I said, okay, well, let me go. I got the interview, and I went to Mass General, but I had a problem with the plane, and it was a connecting flight, and so the flight was canceled. So I was going to miss what we did. It was the group interviews, and everybody would come and they'd do the group interviews. That was back in the day. I don't know if you remember that. And so I had to take a bus. I had to take a bus from Denver on the Greyhound bus to New York.
Oh my.
And I was in the Port Authority, had never been there before, and I just missed the bus to Boston. And so I had to wait there for 3 to 4 hours, and I remember being there and seeing these people who were homeless back then. And saying, okay, how am I going to make it through this tonight? And you know, these are people that, you know, that I can't be attacked. And so I just kept walking around until finally that bus came that I needed to get on. And I got here a day late. I mean, I came to Massachusetts a day late, and I was like mortified. I'm like, what am I going to say? So I called them and I said, listen, back then we didn't have cell phones, okay? So I called them and I said to the residency program director that I'm so sorry. I missed my plane, and I'm here for an interview. So they said, well, we've got you squared away. We're going to have you see a couple of people. And Nina Tokoff-Rubin was one of my interviewees. She was one of my interviewers. And I walked into her office, and she said, your dean's letter is fabulous. She says, I don't know whether to roll out the red carpet or give you a glass of wine. And that was my first sign I belong here.
Yeah, isn't that great? What a great
Yeah,
story.
yeah.